Good evening. My name is Jerry Cash, and we're here tonight this Tuesday in February, and we have as a guest Tom Holmes. And Tom has had a fabulous career with the U.S. Weather Service, and Tom is a local guy. He's from Marlboro originally. He's been through his working career with the U.S. Weather Service, and now he's come back home, and he's living in Grafton, right, Tom? But I was just looking at some information that Tom gave to me about his background, and it's interesting. Just to go over a little bit about Tom's background, we're here basically to talk about El Niño, as Tom pointed out. It has that Spanish inflection, not Nino, but El Niño. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but just a few things about Tom's background. Tom has tremendous credibility to talk about this because, number one, he had 40 years approximately as an employee of the U.S. Weather Service, and of course he was in the service as well. And Tom started out graduated from Marlboro High School, and then went into the U.S. Navy in 1954. So we sort of have a little kinship in that regard, in the sense that my own Navy career was spent in those years, and I was in a naval fighter squadron, and we went on various aircraft carriers. Found out Tom was on the Lake Champlain, which was one of the aircraft carriers we happen to be on. The way the thing works in the Navy, you move around a lot and so forth. But Tom got into the weather business really in the Navy, right, Tom?
That's right.
And how did that actually happen? I mean, did you just stumble into it, or did you have an interest in it, or how did that actually happen?
It was pretty much a stumble. What happened was I went into the Navy, and when I went in the Navy, they decided what was best for you. And I told a man in boot camp that I wanted to be a machinist mate on a submarine, because I was very young at the time, don't forget. And he said, "Okay, son, I'll see what I can do." And
you one of those famous military guarantees.
That's right.
You're heading for the submarine. Next thing you know, you're on an aircraft carrier.
No, he sent me to aviation school out in Oklahoma, and I thought, that's a strange place to send me if I'm going aboard a submarine.
Exactly.
And then from aviation, I went to the meteorology school in New Jersey.
You certainly had an interesting career. Now, you finish up your naval career at Patuxent River, which I knew was a naval test center, as I recall it.
That's right.
Was at that time for naval aircraft and
yes,
so
a couple of pilots were John Glenn and Alan Shepard, you might have heard about.
Well, John Glenn, Alan Shepard, I think, is retired, but he's from New Hampshire. John Glenn, going
back up.
So he hasn't had enough yet. He wants another trip at that.
He was Major Glenn back then.
Well, he ended up being, I guess, a full colonel, and then he went in the space ride, and he's going back up again. Now, you got into the Weather Service, and we're just going to go over this a little quickly, Tom, but you've had some real interesting assignments, and Tom gave me a little summary here, and I know that you were, at one point, you were wintering over, as you say, on a polar plateau in Antarctica. Now, how did you get to, where was that? How did you get to that point? What were you doing there?
Well, I started in Washington, D.C., actually, and then I volunteered for that research expedition to the South Pole. Mm-hmm. And we actually wintered over up there, at an altitude of 10,000 feet.
Wow.
Temperature gets to 100 below zero and things like that.
What kind of living quarters did they provide? Were they like Quonset huts?
This was 37 years ago now.
Okay, yeah.
We lived in tunnels underneath the ice, actually.
Wow, okay.
It's almost like living in mines.
Yeah.
Because nothing can survive up on top of the ice because of the winds.
That's sure, yeah. Probably nothing but townhouses up there now, but...
yeah, they live pretty good down there now, but there were 19 of us.
Right.
And there was about 6 from the international group. We had all different nationalities.
Okay. So it was an international cooperation, yes. And how did you get along, language-wise?
Well, the English was the main language used, and the Russians and the Japanese and the others all spoke a little bit of English.
At that time, having Russians with you would be unusual, wouldn't be today, but plus that was the Cold War.
We didn't discuss politics.
Russia didn't be bad for them. But now, from another activity that Tom, he spent another period of time riding out winter storms with the Coast Guard cutters. Now, how did you get into that, Tom? I mean, what?
Well, that was called the North Atlantic Weather Patrol, and we used to go up in the North Atlantic to study the weather conditions, and the Coast Guard was kind enough to take us up on station with them for a month at a time. Mm-hmm. And you really haven't lived till you ride on a 255-foot Coast Guard cutter in the North Atlantic in the winter. It's you're underwater more than That's the closest I got to submarine duty, actually.
Yeah. Well, actually, right. That used to be the old joke, because when we were on aircraft carriers, we could see the destroyers, which may be larger than those cutters you were
Twice
talking
as
about.
big.
And in rough seas, they would be going virtually, you know, it seemed underwater, and we'd be having a lot of sympathy for them. But
I did that for 3 years. That was enough.
I don't know how you know, as far as the seasickness aspect of things, you must have a cast iron stomach, because
I never got seasick.
Yeah.
Luckily.
I've seen people get seasick on aircraft carriers, and you know how big they are, but they do get a gentle roll
Right.
in the swells, and some people that were
You have to
affected.
remember, a lot of these things took place when I was young.
Yeah.
A lot of things you do when you're young that you don't do when you're older.
That's right, and you can withstand a lot of stuff when you're young, and you don't realize that maybe you shouldn't be here anyway, but that goes with the age, you know. Now, here's another total contrast. You were in the desert. We were talking about winter storms in the North Atlantic, and where it's very hot, wet and cold, I should say. And you were in Nevada, I guess. This is down in the desert while nuclear devices were being tested and
At the
detonated.
Nevada test site.
Yeah. What years was that, Tom?
I went
roughly?
out to Nevada when I come back from the South Pole, actually. I went from 100 degrees below zero to 120 degrees above zero.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was 1961 to 64.
Mm-hmm.
Then I had 2 tours of duty in Nevada. I went back in 67 until 69.
Yeah.
And the
So-
first tour was when they were setting off the bombs. You know, we were giving weather
Right.
support for the nuclear
Yeah.
testing. The second tour of duty was we were testing nuclear reactors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did the second time.
Yeah.
But
So they
it was
weren't.
very interesting.
The reactors were not explosions per se.
No, we'd run them critical just to see what they'd do.
Push them to the limit type
But
thing.
most of that research, of course, is
Yeah.
pretty well stopped now because
No,
of
right, because of the test ban treaties. and
Right.
stuff. Now, what was your role there, Tom, in terms of being with that test operation?
our role was in the weather group. We supplied all the information in case of accident.
Mm-hmm.
Like many years ago, there was an event down at 3 Mile Island.
Oh, sure.
I was the weatherman down there for that event. You know, in case anything leaked out,
Yeah.
we'd be able to track the cloud if it did come out, which it didn't come out, by the way. But
Yeah.
in case of accident, we.
Now, Tom, we're sitting pretty close here. You mentioned 3 Mile Island. You mentioned these test sites in Nevada. You're not radioactive, are you?
Actually, when you're the weatherman on site, you don't give your go-ahead until you make sure that wind is blowing in the opposite direction
Right,
from
yeah.
where you are.
you don't want to be downwind, and certainly, you know, type of things. So I guess that testing phase, of course, is long gone now. But they did it underground, though, didn't they? Wasn't it?
Most
at
of it
that
was
stage?
underground.
Yeah.
Once in a while, there was a mistake made where we got hit by a few rocks that come out, but
Yeah, yeah. Well, you certainly, and then another thing. This is in 1976 when they had one of the big tall ships events, and I remember that very clearly. You were involved in sailing with the tall ships, and you went across the Atlantic.
yes, I came across with them to Newport. I
Right.
sailed across with them, providing weather support for the whole trip from. Actually, I picked them up in Bermuda. There were
Okay.
17 of them.
Mhm.
And I joined them in Bermuda and rode to Newport with them, and that was a thrilling trip. I'd
Yeah.
do that again tomorrow if I could.
Was that a rougher ride than those Coast Guard cutters?
Oh
or
no,
was,
that was
pretty
one of the
slow?
problems on that trip is there wasn't any wind.
Mhm.
They started off having a race from Bermuda to Newport, but
Okay.
we soon had to drop sails and go onto auxiliary power, to get to Newport on time for the celebration.
Right.
Then we raised the sails before we went into Newport Harbor just for the.
Yeah,
The
for
show,
for the
yeah.
appearance and to make it.
it
It was
was,
quite a sight. I mean. Yeah.
It's quite a sight when you're
Yeah.
out there too.
Yeah.
Believe me.
Well, that was quite an experience. And of course it says here you were at the Winter Olympics also in 1970. Now where were they in that particular
Up in
year?
Lake Placid,
Okay, Lake Placid. Okay.
Lake Placid, New York.
Yeah.
And we just provided weather support for the different
Yeah.
events during
Yeah.
the Olympics. You know,
Right.
the 90-meter jump. And,
So you had some interesting assignments, and that only touches on it lightly in your U.S. Weather Bureau career. And
Well, most of my career was as a special projects person. In other words, where they don't have a weather office per se, they send
Yeah.
a special group of people in to to take
Almost
care
like
of
a
the
troubleshooter
situation, whether
or-
it's trouble or a celebration or whatever.
Right.
I much prefer the celebrations.
Yeah, then 3 Mile Island. Newport is nicer. But you came you came full circle. I noticed that back in 1980, after being virtually around the United States and around the world in many sense, you came back to the weather office in Worcester in 1980, and you were chief of the weather office there, and then you retired in 1995. So you had a good stint in Worcester as well.
That's right. And one of the amazing things was that many years ago in Marlborough, I was taking flying lessons when I was just a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first weather stations I ever went into was Worcester Airport.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Never did I think that I'd
You
go
would be
back
there
there many
later.
years
Yeah.
later.
Now just speaking of that, just as an aside, isn't that quite a challenge landing at Worcester Airport? I mean, I always
No,
wonder
the challenge is landing in Marlborough Airport, actually.
Okay. That's the one on Farm Road, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I know what you mean.
1,500-foot runway.
Hopefully you don't hit that house that's directly across the street from the runway. And,
When I was taking lessons, television had just come out, and they had put a television antenna on top of that farmhouse.
Well, I guess they figure that they'll know. At least they'll get a 2-second warning if something bad happens, with a television antenna going. But so Tom has had a real interesting career, as you can tell, and we're just touching the surface of it. But we wanted to get into just discussing some of the things about El Nino Town, because just the other day there was a real tragic situation in Florida. Now, many news reports attributed that to the somewhat of the, indirectly at least, the effects of El Nino. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But with those tornadoes hitting down in central Florida, and there was a lot of deaths there. But just speaking in general, let's talk about, well, how did we get the name El Nino, for example? I know it's a Spanish, it's as you mentioned previously. Maybe you can explain that.
Okay, it's a natural event, El Nino. It's an upwelling of warm water in the western Pacific that gradually moves to the east, and it actually raises the water temperature off the northwest coast of South America quite a bit. And in fact, this year, I believe the water temperature has been raised 20 to 30 degrees above what it normally does.
That's significant. Yeah.
And in the atmosphere, in this transfer of energy, heat is energy.
Mm-hmm.
And when this El Nino becomes so potent as to raise the water temperature that much, it gives off a lot of heat. And what it does is it reinforces that southern jet stream that
Which is already
continuously
there.
circles around. But normally, like in the Northeast, the northern jet stream is our weather maker in the wintertime. That's what generally carries the storms down over us, from the polar regions. And also brings that cold air down normally that we haven't seen too much of this year. But this year, the southern jet stream has been predominant.
I see.
Up until now, at least. It still is, I have no reason to believe that it won't continue.
Right.
And the southern jet stream is causing havoc in Southern California. Southern California just isn't used to getting all these storms at this time of year. So, you see these mudslides and the rain is terrible.
Northern California, and even probably Southern California too, but they've had more rain in the month of February than any time in record.
That's right.
This particular year.
Right.
But do we know for sure that is it pretty well understood and accepted that that's all caused by this El Nino effect? In other words, this predominant southern jet, is it pretty well known? Or?
Well, as I say, the El Nino is giving off so much heat that as I say, this energy is going into that southern jet and just keeping it as a predominant jet.
Right.
Now, there's other reasons you could have storms, of course, but the El Nino is a big influence, and normally our storms come down from the polar regions. We get that cold air. Like today, if this were a normal winter storm coming up the East Coast, like we've had in prior years, I know at my house I've had over 2 inches of rain already. I don't know what we have now, but it's still coming down pretty good. That would be a couple feet of snow had we had some cold air north of us. But we just don't have that cold air. Every storm that's come up has just been a rain-snow situation.
That happened even last week too, I think. And
that's right.
It's rare to have a northeaster that rain, as you say, in February. So one of the things that, as a result of El Nino, is the southern jet stream is perhaps because of this energy you were talking about and the heat in the Pacific, perhaps more stronger or more predominant than it might be if that heat, that energy source wasn't making it stronger. Is that true? Or?
Yes, I don't think there's been any mention of the northern jet stream in the past 2 months. You know, when you watch the 6 o'clock news, whether it be Dick Albert or Harvey Leonard or one of them, you know, they talk about the jet stream, of course, every night. And you can see for yourself that very seldom is that northern jet stream mentioned anymore. We don't get that influx of real cold air coming down, you know, over the Great Lakes. And
when you see the national weather map and if they talk about jet streams, they're, like I say, they're often talking about coming across the southern tier of the United States. I mean, right now, in this current set of conditions, which is what led to some of these problems in Florida. I mean, the fact that they had tornadoes.
They shouldn't be getting thunderstorms that strong this time of year.
Right.
So there's
it's had an impact, and as you say, the coast of California and California in general has had more rain than they've ever been able to handle almost out there.
A little sidebar to that, my brother vacations in Palm Springs, California, and he always kids me when he calls, you know, he says, look, I'm out at the pool, you know, and everything. This year he's been calling and saying, you know, it's been raining for the past 3 days, and it's terrible, we haven't been able to use the pool.
Desert, right?
I said, come to the Northeast where it's nice and warm.
Well, I can tell you this, just as another sidebar, a little personal aside. I was we were in the city of Las Vegas in early February, and we were coming back. We actually went to the Grand Canyon. We're driving back, and we had a torrential downpour. Now, Las Vegas is the desert, and to us it didn't seem that unusual to have a torrential downpour, but actually they were breaking into the newscasts out there, and one of the things that they don't have, at least in the streets we were going on, is storm drains, and the water was all over the place, 4 inches high in some places. But of course, out there, typically the next day the sun was out and everything dried off, and everybody.
I lived in Las Vegas for 6 years. You know, any rain in Las Vegas is a disaster.
That's right. It was a real newsmaker for them. Well, getting back to it, so the jet stream is certainly one of the things that's been affected by this. Does anybody know? Now, it really goes back to the source of an area in the Pacific that generates this heat and energy.
Upwelling of warm water.
Okay. Does anybody even have any theories on even what is the cause of that? You know.
Well, it's a natural occurrence. As far as what the root cause of it is, I don't know. I don't know if they've really gotten to the actual. It's
a pretty big area too.
Oh
right?
yes. Most of the Pacific is actually affected by it.
Right.
But it's just that it doesn't last this long normally. I think this is one of the biggest El Niños ever recorded. But you know, one thing, I kept on talking about the jet stream earlier. I just want to clarify that I'm sure everyone knows what the jet stream is. It's sort of a river, of air up around 40,000 feet. High winds, pilots will use it if they're traveling from the west to the east. They'll get up in the jet stream to save on fuel and get there faster. But the jet stream is continuously circling the globe, both the jet stream, the northern jet stream and the southern jet stream, and it's the track for our weather. Actually, it controls most of where our weather goes, the storms. So that's what I meant when I was talking about the southern jet stream taking over.
Under normal conditions, the jet stream fluctuates a little bit.
That's right. That's right. It has big loops in it.
There's maybe some balance between north and south in a normal.
Normally in February in Massachusetts, when you look at the 6 o'clock news and see what the jet stream's doing, you'll see it coming down from the state of Washington, down to Texas, across the Norfolk, and back up off Nantucket. You know, that's a normal northern jet stream.
So that permits the cold air.
And our storms will come down that way, and the cold air is coming down in the middle. And of course, when the storm comes up the east coast and starts pouring this rain in on us, the cold air is coming from the northwest, and the tube, we get the snow.
And you can get some pretty big snowstorms when that condition
occurs. That's right, the typical nor'easter.
Northeastern and so forth, that's right. Now, how is it known at this point in time how often this El Nino effect occurs? Is there some frequency that people have been able to track?
We've tracked them. I've seen them tracked from around the turn of the century. And they usually occur every 4 to 6 years, abnormal El Niños. you can have one, you know, this year and have another one next year for that matter.
Right,
But if
yeah.
you wanted to talk about an average El Nino, it's only 4 to 6 years.
Over time, it's been an average
That's
4 to
right.
6 years, yeah.
That's right.
So it's really a natural phenomenon, and it's not precise and scientific in terms of, well, it's going
No.
to occur every 18 months or something of that nature.
No, it's pretty hard to predict when they're actually going to happen. But one thing we did find, myself and a fellow from our Boston office, Bob Case, we once did a study of 20 El Ninos since the beginning of the century. And we found, you know, we wanted to see how it was going to affect New England weather. You know, we looked at our climatological data. But what we found out by accident, really, was the winter following an El Nino was usually severe in the Northeast.
So
That's,
snowplow people get, wait till next year. That's all we can say. Like the
I think
baseball
it was
team, wait till next
something
year.
like 18 of the 20 we studied had an abnormally bad winter the following year
Yeah.
after the El Nino.
Yeah.
Why that is, I don't really know, but
Maybe just a normal cycle of events.
That's
that,
right.
Things sort of even out over time.
but I thought that was an interesting thing that we found it.
Well, it's causing a lot of havoc, and the Florida people certainly know about that, and the just the forecasting technology itself. Just speaking in general of how to forecast, how weather forecasting, like when you started in the U.S. Weather Bureau. What was the basic data you used to? I mean, where did it come from? I mean, did it?
When we started a shift in the weather office, I'm going way back now, the first thing we did was we had to plot the charts. We had to actually sit down, get all the messages off the radio, and actually make little plots, and then actually draw the isobars on, and
Okay.
you know, I mean, it took us
Now, isobars are
lines of equal pressure. Those are those squiggly lines you see Dick Albert show on the weather map at night.
and if they get too close, it gets windy or something.
That's right, and that's how we
yeah.
determine where the high pressure is and the low pressure is, and
Okay.
which way the storms are moving, etc.
Now, the stars played a role in enabling you to do this in terms of geographic positioning, or how did they work
No.
into it?
No, we plotted all the maps by hand.
Okay.
Nowadays, nothing is done by hand anymore.
Right.
Everything is done by computer or some other machines that we have. When I first started, we didn't have satellite data. We didn't have any satellites. We didn't have the radars that we have today. We had some basic radars, but they weren't the weather Doppler radars that we have today.
Right. Now, I've heard that phrase Doppler. Is there something about a Doppler radar that's different than other types of radars?
Well, the radar we had up at the Worcester Airport for years just measured reflectivity. In other words, the ions would go out and hit the object, the thunderstorm or what have you, and bounce back, and we just see a general area
It's sort of a
of
profile.
where the weather is. That's right.
Yeah.
But nowadays, the Doppler radar can see right into that storm, and it can actually determine which way the droplets are moving. And by doing that, you can actually get a picture of a vortex, say, within the thunderstorm cell, which is great. Great to
Yeah,
have.
I don't know if you ever got involved with the media end of it, but if you just look at the computerization and graphics of the commercial channels and the way they all try to one-upsmanship on how they show weather patterns. In one case, they may be showing the map of the eastern United States with the the cloud formations above, and in another one they have other ways of doing it. But plus, that's not weather forecasting per se. That's just presentation. I understand all that. But just the satellite input must help in terms of gathering data for weather forecasting.
Oh, definitely.
And
Especially
roughly
in
when
the-
did that come into play?
That came in the 60s, but it came in very slowly. The satellite data is the best during hurricane season. To track a hurricane with the satellite data is phenomenal. I mean, you can get a picture, just a few minutes after it's taken, and you can get the eye of that storm, and that's information we never had. And we'd rely on ship reports, and most ships, if the captain was smart, wouldn't be anywhere near the hurricane.
Yeah.
But no, the satellite information was fantastic, and it's getting more fantastic. They're more sophisticated now. They're giving us more information between the radar and the satellite. And we have another product now that we didn't have years ago. It's called a computer model of the atmosphere. You probably heard them talk about the model showed this and the model showed that. It's a mathematical model of the atmosphere that can take any given situation and show how that's going to react 60 hours from now. Which, you almost don't have to be a meteorologist anymore. You can just take the information from the model per se and just give it to the news people.
Right.
This model is getting more perfected every year, and it's I think
So
they're up to
there's so many more tools available.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it reminds me, getting back to the El Nino thing, is that back in several months ago there was a conference in California which the vice president attended, and there were many other luminaries from that part of the world, and it was talking about El Nino in preparation for it. And I was just wondering at the time, what could they possibly do to prepare? I mean, it's sort of, weather is inevitable. It's sort of
Well, as far as California, I think they filled a lot of sandbags beforehand.
That's about all.
But
Yeah.
I think there are certain things that civil defense people can, or I should say emergency management people can do prior to, if they know that something's coming like that, they can reinforce seawalls, they can, there's a lot of activity that can be.
It seemed like it's just so overwhelming that you can only take certain steps, and that's about as far as
That's right. Mother Nature is a powerful force.
That's,
and even if you know El Nino's coming, you know there's going to be big problems.
Right. Well, it's been interesting talking about it, Tom, and you certainly have a background that you started 40 years ago, and you were covering this, and you've seen the whole march of technology as it has since been introduced to the Weather Bureau, and
some good, some bad.
Okay. I'm sure if it's like any technology, you'll still need the human presence.
That's
and
right.
that will continue to be so. You need interpretation. You can have a lot of measuring and a lot of data input, but somebody has to take that and now apply it and interpret it, no matter how many models you produce, or at least present it in a way that's understandable to the general public, let's put it that way. So really, we thank you for coming over. There's really a lot more we could talk about, but we've pretty much run out of our time here. And did you have any parting message about El Nino and what we should prepare for the future?
No, actually the Northeast makes out pretty good with an El Nino. It's the South and the West that really catch it.
Right. But based on what Tom said, watch out next year.
I'd advise you to get a snowblower if you don't have one.
If the form follows that it has in the past. So thank you very much, Tom, for coming over.
You're quite welcome.
Tom Holmes will now take telephone calls from anyone in town that's watching the program, and he'd be willing to answer any questions you may have. So if you feel free to call 838-0015, Tom will give you the answers. Tom, there's a question here. You want to take that call?
This is Tom Holmes. Okay, this view. Okay. She wanted to know if I could talk more about some of the weather stories we talked about in the beginning, about some of the places I've been and things like that. Well, yeah, we pretty much covered it. I think one of the most interesting places was in the Antarctic 36 years ago. This is a place where we had an international group. We didn't see any other civilization for 6 months when the sun goes down. No one can fly in there. It gets so cold that we lived in these tunnels underneath the ice, and you had to climb up this ladder to get out. And you'd open up the hatch, and you could take a glass of tap water straight from the tap, open up that hatch and throw it, and you'd hear it pop, and it would bounce off the ice there. That gets pretty cold. You had to cover everything. You had to wear a snorkel so your lungs wouldn't freeze and things like that. If you blinked, your eyelids would freeze. It was a pretty remarkable place. And as I said before, I went from there to the desert, the Mojave Desert, and you talk about a change in climate. That was amazing. 120, 130 degrees over at Death Valley, and then from the Mojave Desert with the Coast Guard up in the North Atlantic Weather Patrol, and again a big change in climate, and that was interesting. Those Coast Guard cutters we used to ride on were all built back in the 30s. So most of them, just the paint was holding them together, you know. If you scrape off the paint, you just find holes in the hull. And you see 50, 60 foot seas in the North Atlantic on one of those things. Very interesting. But as I say, all this stuff was when I was young, and you know, as you get older, you get smarter. You know, they have a thing out in the West where they track tornadoes. You've seen them out there. They're trying to get these instruments in front of the tornadoes and everything. If you look closely, you'll see that the older fellows are all back in the office, and the younger people are all out in the pickup trucks chasing the tornadoes. And good reason for that. But anyways, I'd be happy to answer any more of your questions you might have. If you want to call here, it's 838-0015.
We have a visitor here watching it, Tom, and he wants to know when you figure or anticipate the end of the El Nino period. How far have we been into it, and how much time is left?
That's a good question, though, because I think they're planning on it ending in the spring, probably early summer. But there's also another school of thought now that this might even continue through the summer. I don't think anyone really knows when the El Nino will stop, because it's such a gigantic event. You know, this is covering most of the Pacific. That's not a small area. And Mother Nature, sometimes, you know, we used to try to outguess Mother Nature. I did for 40 years, and quite often she threw a little monkey wrench in the works. Sometimes I really thought I had a good forecast. Everything was lining up perfectly for this forecast. And it would change completely. And after the fact, you realize why it happened, but that was after the fact, you know. And sometimes it's very hard to explain to your audience why you blew it, especially if it has anything to do with snow. If you miss a forecast on snow, that phone never stops ringing.
Tom, in today's weather service operation, do they feed basic data to commercial weather forecast? Is there a relationship there?
Oh yes, very close relationship. We used to have meetings at least 2 or 3 times a year with all the meteorologists, you know, Harvey Leonard and Dick Albert and all those people.
Right.
And we'd go over all the ground rules, you know, with change of seasons and things like that. And we worked very, very closely because we relied on them very heavily to get our information out.
Right.
Only the National Weather Service puts out warnings. They're the only ones that put out warnings. Mm-hmm. So when you hear a media type person put out a warning, he's doing it with the blessing of the National Weather Service. Right. Yeah. Hopefully. Yeah. Because if everybody were allowed to put out warnings, it would be chaotic. Right. You know, there would be a few individuals that would put them out.
Did the Weather Service grow over the years in your tenure there? Were they growing in terms of people? I know they certainly were changing in technology, but I mean, did they get bigger as time went by?
Not really. There was about 350 offices in the United States. Most of them were pretty small offices. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a big organization, but we had a pretty good handle on things. Then with the automation, with the computers and things like that, then they had a big cutback in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. They actually cut about 150 offices out. Mm-hmm. Now in talking to like right in this area, we used to have an office in Concord, Hartford, Bridgeport, Providence, Chatham, Boston, Worcester, and they're all closed down.
Worcester is not operational?
No. Now they have automated systems in all these places, and the only office now is in Taunton, which covers all of southern New England.
Covers the whole region. Huh?
And they're a little bit stretched on this too, the fellows down there. I talked to them quite a bit, and now they're talking about cutting more.
Now, Tom, there's an organization called NOAA.
That's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Is that related to the Weather Bureau? I know that they're into the climate in some way.
Right. NOAA was our parent agency under the Department of Commerce. Okay. You had the Department of Commerce, then NOAA, then the National Weather Service, the Coastal Geodetic Survey, the Fisheries Bureau, all these other agencies were under NOAA.
Right. So what is NOAA's mission? I know the Weather Service is that National Weather Service is one part of it, but what else does NOAA do?
Well, it's just like in its name, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In other words, the oceans and the atmosphere. That's anything related to those two
they might
would be under NOAA.
Yeah.
It was,
Yeah.
that was established back in 61, I believe. No,
Mhm.
before Weather Bureau, it was Weather Bureau before that.
Okay.
And we're a separate agency.
Mhm.
And they got away from the name Bureau, they called it, because it sounded bureaucratic,
Yeah.
and they changed the name to National Weather Service.
Now, the people we see on television, the typical Channel 4, the usual typical channels, are they often meteorologists, or is there a mix, or?
Okay, in the Boston market they are.
Uh-huh.
Don Kent didn't have a degree, but he was a darn good meteorologist.
Because he had
But,
a lot of practical years of experience, right?
He was a nice man.
Yeah.
He is a nice man.
Yeah.
But yes, in the Boston market, the bigger markets are all meteorologists. Some of the smaller markets, they aren't. You know, if you go to Winslow, Arizona, or, you know, other places like that,
Right.
smaller places, you'll find people just what we call rip and read. In other words, they take the forecast from the
Sure.
National Weather Service and just read it at 6 o'clock. And there's nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that, of course. But in the Boston market, there's so much competition, and
Sure.
you know, they've always, you mentioned earlier, the graphics they use. You
Mhm.
know, those graphics aren't cheap either, believe me.
Yeah. We had a person in Berlin, by the way, who did a lot of the computer graphics work for Channel 5, I believe it was, and he no longer lives in Berlin, but he was working on a contract with them to help them. This is 3 or 4 years ago, but they're very complex. But have you ever seen Al in New Hampshire, Weather with Al?
Yes,
Is he a
I have.
meteorologist? You know what I'm
I
talking
don't,
about?
yes, I know. I don't know him personally, but I know who you're talking about, yes.
He's got his own, I guess that's his own little show business
Yeah.
approach. With
He's
the
a sort
high
of
voice.
a leftover from, in the 60s, a lot of the meteorologists tried that. They started doing weird things, you know, like dressing like a witch or dressing like something else. And that only lasted a few years, thank God.
Well, he's a holdover then. Yeah. He's up in New Hampshire, but he's doing okay.
Yeah,
He's doing okay.
And they went back to being a little bit more serious.
Right.
Dick Albert can be a little silly at times, but if you know
He-
Dick Albert, he's the same person off camera as he is on.
He's
So.
been doing that for a good period of time, many decades, as a matter of fact. And,
But he's very likable. So.
yeah, and there seems to be a stability, at least in that part of the media game, in terms of
That's right.
the Bruce Schweglers and the Dick
That's
Alberts
right.
and the Harvey Leonards and so forth.
That's right. They do. They've been around for quite a while.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Actually, in the Bolton Berlin area, there's been meteorologists. There's Carroll, I think it's Channel 5. He used to live in Berlin.
Is that right?
Yeah, right. He lived here for a few years out on Boylston Road. And there's Neil Estano from Bolton, who is known throughout the area
Right.
here. And he's gone big time. He's down in Florida. He's got some big stations, right? Just a young fellow, too.
Yeah. If you are a young meteorologist trying to get into the media business, you know, you don't make a lot of money at the beginning. Believe me, it's a long process. You know, I know Dick and Harvey and those fellows make a good paycheck, but they work for it. They went a long time on low wages before they started.
And it's tremendously competitive, I would think.
Oh,
Of
definitely.
People trying to break in. You know, it's funny
They
when
don't
you,
have a union either.
right. When you compare the weather forecast in the southwest, let's say, or maybe semi-desert areas where things do not change normally that dramatically. They might give 90 seconds on the smaller stations.
Right.
Tomorrow hot and sunny, just like it was yesterday and the day before, and it'll be tomorrow, on to the sports. But in New England, they really make because there is so much changeability, I think maybe they make
It's
more
one of the more
document.
difficult areas to forecast for, there's no doubt
It is,
about
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, when I lived in Las Vegas, I mean, we put out a forecast on Sunday afternoon and let it ride until next Sunday morning. I mean, hot and sunny during the day.
And dry. And dry.
But that's true though. I mean, the forecast was very simple.
More stability in it.
You know, that once a year you forecast rain, you're sticking your neck out in Las
Right.
Vegas.
In the major broadcasting studios, do they work nights and day when there's a serious batch of storms come
Oh,
in,
definitely.
such as now? They're
Oh,
in there not
definitely.
morning,
They go
noon, and
into a
night.
weather alert mode that,
That's it.
yeah, there's usually at least two of them will go on duty right through the night. That goes for Channel 5, Channel 4, Channel 7, what have you. Yeah, they do that. You know, it's interesting to see their weather broadcast because the weatherman on TV is the only one that doesn't have a script. You know, the sports person has a script,
Yeah.
the news anchors have
Sure.
a script, but the weatherman doesn't, the weather person I should
Mhm.
say, because he's the one, he can be cut at the last minute. In other words, he'll start into his forecast, and all of a sudden he'll be told, you know, you're going too long, or we got another news item coming up, so, you know, let's go to that. So you've got to be able to adjust real quickly.
Well, Tom, I've been off camera for a few seconds, cooling down this weather forecast. It was getting too hot under these lights, but we just want to sign off here and thank you very much for tuning in. And Tom is a real interesting person, and he actually, we just sort of touched the surface in some of these areas. But thanks again, and Tom, thanks for coming to Berlin.
I enjoyed it.
Appreciate it. Because you're here playing golf regularly, so you know.
I'll see some of you out in the golf course.
Okay.